Good morning again. I want to tell you how glad I am to be able to be here and to share the Word of God and some of these very important things that we've been discussing the last few weeks concerning the Holy Flesh movement that was in the Adventist Church in 1899 to 1901, and the revival of some of these very same concepts. And at the core of all this is the doctrine of the Incarnation. Now, someone who has seen the first couple presentations on the internet apparently was appreciative, but they said something like, well, you really need to deal with the issue of the propensities. I think that's really the issue it comes down to. And I agree to a great degree that that is true, and I wanted to study on that today. But we're going to actually somewhat delay that till next time because we want to lay some groundwork for it. I think that this is actually necessary, and it's a large subject of itself and needs a whole study, but we need some preparation for that. And so today we're going to be looking at John chapter 1 verse 14, and we're going to be looking at some expressions of Ellen White in relationship to that. But the title of the message is simply, The Word was made flesh. The Word was made flesh. The Gospel of John was the last account of the life of Christ that was written, that we have in the Bible. And in fact, it was probably one of the last books of the Old Testament that was penned. And for the final portion of the canon to be finished, it had to have this complete view of Jesus Christ, His incarnation, and His teachings. Now, most everyone who's studied the issue very thoroughly understands that the New Testament was written in Greek. The Spirit of Prophecy confirms the New Testament was written in Greek. We know that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. But again, the Greek and Hebrew languages are quite different in many respects. And so there were certain words and concepts from the Hebrew construct that had to be adapted, if you pleased, or actually even introduced into the Greek to relay the same truths that would have been spoken in another language. One of the most adapted words is the Greek word logos. Logos. It's the word that we translate word, or one of the words we translate word in the New Testament, and particularly in John chapter 1. In John chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, we read here in the beginning of the Gospel of John these very simple but sublime words about Jesus Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. The Greek word we translate word here is from logos. Now, in the Old Testament, the Word of God, His Word was closely associated with Himself and His presence. In the Old Testament, we find a Hebrew word, devar, and it has a meaning of speech or word. And let me just share with you a few places where that Hebrew word is used. In fact, it's used many, many times, but some that you would recognize quickly. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 1. And God spake all these words, saying, when God spoke His 10 words, the Hebrew, devar, is used. In 2 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 23, here we find this word used in an interesting way. In fact, in some places it's actually translated oracle. Oracle. And the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. Now, you know, an oracle was like a person or a prophet that supposedly God was to speak through. And so it says that it was as if a man had inquired at the oracle or the word of God when Ahithophel spoke. It was just as if God was speaking through him. In Psalm 17 and verse 4, Psalm 17 verse 4, he says, concerning the works of men, by the word of thy lips I have kept me from the paths of the destroyer. And the word that we translate word here, by the word of thy lips, is again devar. Devar could be equated as an audible expression of the Shekinah glory. It was as if it was the audible expression of the Shekinah glory. Now it's interesting that if we look in the Greek translation of the Old Testament that we call the Septuagint, sometimes it's just abbreviated as 70, LXX in the Roman numerals. If we look into the Septuagint of Exodus chapter 20 verse 1, 2 Samuel 16:23, or Psalm 17:4, and in fact in many other places, the Hebrew word devar is translated as logos in the Greek, logos. And so those translators were considering these terms somewhat equivalent, if you please. But even with this background, even with the fact that for over 150, perhaps 250 almost years of the history of the Septuagint to the point of John's writing his gospel, it must have come as almost like a bombshell to the reader to read what John would write in John chapter 1 and verse 14. John chapter 1 verse 14. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. He says the Word, the Logos, was made sarx. The Greek word for flesh. It was made sarx and dwelt. The Greek word is askenosane. It means to tabernacle. And so this word, this divine wisdom, if you please, this audible presence of God, dwelt now in sarx, in flesh. Now, we might ask, well, why was this considered such an overwhelming surprise to those people who must have read it? We today might not see the significance in that. But this is because this Greek word logos is a very loaded word with cultural implications. For example, the Seventh-day Adventist Bible Commentary, it states this: logos, as a technical term, seems to have originated with the Stoics, who used it to denote divine wisdom as the integrating force of the universe. Seventh-day Adventist Bible Commentary, Volume 5, page 894. And so to the Greek mind, imbued with the dualism of the philosophers, such a transformation would just be unthinkable to those people. Because logos is spiritual, therefore good. But the flesh, the sarx, it's physical, therefore it is intrinsically vile, corrupt, and evil. With this background of the concept of logos, we can understand then where they came up with this idea of good soul in a vile body. You know, good soul, good mind, bad body. The dualism that this crept into even medieval Christian theology. To the Greek mind, the logos becoming sarx was equivalent to saying the good had become evil. The good had become evil. But of course, good never became evil, did it? But you see, friends, we are not Hellenists. We are not people of that Greek culture or philosophy. We are Christians. We are, if you please, the spiritual children of the Hebrews. And we, through seeking the gift of inspiration, we can find out how God can come and tabernacle in flesh. Christ is not the Logos in the Hellenistic sense of thinking, but he is rather the Devar of the Hebrew mind of thinking. He is that, as it were, audible presence of God, that Shekinah, the glory, come and tabernacle, though, in flesh. Now, in connection with this concept, there are many statements in the writings of Ellen White that to some people have seemingly caused confusion or misunderstanding, And it's important that we understand how she used certain words. Those of you who are familiar with my book, The Foundation of Our Faith, know that in the section on the atonement, I have a section called White-isms and the Atonement, where I look at a lot of the statements of Ellen White where she speaks about the atonement being complete, the atonement being finished, these various things, and try to come to a consensus as what she meant by these things. And so in the same sense, there are several theological terms that Ellen White used in connection with the Incarnation that we should examine at this point so that we can have a comprehensive understanding of how she used those terms in relationship to the Incarnation. Now, the first point I want to make is that Ellen White used the terms nature and flesh in the context of the Incarnation as if they were interchangeable. For instance, we read this statement from Signs of the Times of July 30, 1902, paragraph 1. He was ever pure and undefiled, yet he took upon himself our sinful nature. Yet he took upon himself our sinful nature. Now, the next statement I'm going to share with you is also from Signs of the Times. It's from May 16th, 1895. And it's a long statement, and there's really just a portion of it that really super implies to what we're talking about, but the whole statement is so good I want to share it all with you, and then I'll narrow it down to the part that super implies, if that's okay. And by the way, it's interesting to note that this particular statement was published 2 weeks prior to the May 30 edition of the Signs of the Times 1895, and you might think, well, what does that matter? But it was in the May 30 of 1895 edition of Signs of the Times that you find that very famous statement that where she says that Christ was not a son by creation as were the angels, neither a son by adoption as is a forgiven sinner, but a son begotten in the express image of the Father's person. So this is at the very same time she's writing that, she's writing this. And it says this: it should be to us a cause of continual gratitude and rejoicing that Jesus knows our weakness and is acquainted with our temptations. Let me just pause there for a minute. Does he know our weaknesses? Is he acquainted with our temptations because he just had supernatural knowledge without experiencing it? No. That's not what she means at all. It's because he came and dwelt, because the Logos dwelt in sarx, that he could become acquainted with our weaknesses and our temptations. She continues, we are too much in the habit of thinking that the Son of God was a being so entirely exalted above us that it is an impossibility for him to enter into our trials and temptations, and that he can have no sympathy with us in our weaknesses and frailties. This is because we do not take in the fact of his oneness with humanity. And now notice the next sentence. He took upon him the likeness of sinful flesh, and was made in all points like unto his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God. He has engaged himself to save every son and daughter of Adam who will consent to be saved in God's appointed way. Every son and daughter of Adam. Now, comparing these two statements together quickly, in the July 30 statement of 1902, he took upon himself our sinful nature. And then in the May 16th of 1895 statement, he took upon him the likeness of sinful flesh. And we'll discuss a little bit more about this expression, likeness of sinful flesh, in a little bit. We looked at it before, we're going to look at it again. But I want to just share with you an idea that I want you to keep in the back of your head because it will help you as we go through this. And this is a statement in the Adventist Home, but it's from a manuscript, number 1 of 1888, pretty good year. The flesh of itself cannot act contrary to the will of God. The flesh of itself cannot act contrary to the will of God. Now I want to examine, as I said, some of these White-isms, if you call them that we have, which have the word sin as their root word. And see how Ellen White used some of these. And the first one I want to look at is this term sinful. What does it mean to be sinful? Many times the suffix full means to be full of, and at times Ellen White used it as such, but not always. It can also have other meanings. For example, Webster's Unabridged Dictionary can mean to have a tendency toward. American Heritage Dictionary, tendency or ability. I'd like to propose to you that when Ellen White was writing of the Incarnation, this is the usage and how this term should be defined that makes the most sense and that carries a consistency with the other statements in her writings. This definition of understanding it to represent a tendency, it actually gives us a very, if I could say, different perspective than what we might on a surface think of. It certainly falls short of describing an act. According to this usage, the term sinful does not refer to an act of sinning such as we might say being full of sin. It means having a tendency towards sin. This concept accurately describes the flesh or the nature in which fallen humans live. And Ellen White, in discussing the nature in which Christ made his earthly tabernacle, consistently used the term sinful. In fact, over 80 times, Ellen White quotes Romans 8, chapter 8, verse 3, where the Bible states that Jesus was made in the likeness of sinful flesh. Now, I mentioned the term likeness of sinful flesh earlier, and I said we'd come back to it again. And the crux that some people have a problem with in this is the term likeness. When they read the likeness of sinful flesh, they say, well, that means it was something like it, but it wasn't it. Maybe it looked like it, but it really wasn't it. But this word that we translate likeness in the Greek, homeomai, it means that which is made like something. And I'll show you the definition in a minute. But here's a place it's used. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 7. But made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. Now, was Jesus really a man or not? Or was he just made as some kind of apparition? Like he's the cardboard cutout that they put in the supermarket of someone. It looks like the person, but it's really not the person at all. Well, we believe he really was a man. But it's from this same Greek word, which means that which is made like something. Another term we should understand. Sinless. Sinless. The suffix less is usually defined as without and incapable of. For instance, a fearless person is a person who's not capable of fearing, understanding fear. A powerless person would be a person who has no power. A sinless nature would then be a nature without sin or not capable of sinning. But over and over, Ellen White affirmed that Christ never sinned. The Bible affirms over and over that Christ never sinned. She never described him as ever having sinless flesh. While his divine nature was sinless, his human nature or flesh was never given that attribute. She never believed that Christ was incapable of sinning. She believed his temptations were real. She believed that he could have sinned. For example, in Selected Messages, Book 3, on page 130, paragraph 2. He could have yielded to Satan's lying suggestions, as did Adam. But we should adore and glorify the Lamb of God that he did not in a single point yield one jot or one tittle. But he could have. He had a free will. He could have yielded. He could have sinned. But he didn't. She never mentions his human nature as being sinless, incapable of sinning. I would just maybe add something, and this would be like, if you please, an extended footnote in relationship with this. We have been discussing, and highly integral to this situation, is the Holy Flesh movement of the Indiana Conference at the turn of the 20th century. And during that time, Ellen White was in Australia at the height of the movement. And she received a letter on June the 1st of 1900 by an Ida V. Headley. And Arthur White, in his biography series on Ellen White, comments about this, and he quotes part of her letter, and he says this: the questions that this Sister Ida had sent Ellen White, the questions asked in this letter throw some light on the Holy Flesh teaching. Some of these questions were. And now Arthur White is going to quote from her letter to give us some of those questions. And she's asking these questions because they were issues that were being raised in the Holy Flesh movement. Was Mary's body made holy, sinless, in her flesh before conception, so that Christ was born from sinless flesh, and his own body sinless flesh of itself? Hebrews 10:5. Now, are you familiar with the Catholic doctrine of the Immaculate Conception? The Immaculate Conception does not deal with the conception of Jesus Christ directly. It's obviously the point of what they're trying to get to with it. But the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception says that Mary was conceived without any taint of what is called original sin. In other words, Mary had a sinless nature. And because she had a sinless nature, and because Jesus had God as his Father, then Jesus had a sinless nature, a nature incapable of doing wrong. And this was part of the teaching of the Holy Flesh movement. But I want to remind you, as I have for the last 2 weeks, what Ellen White said about this movement. And I quote, "None are to pick up any points of this doctrine and call it truth. There is not a thread of truth in the whole fabric." But friends, it was this very concept of Christ coming in sinless flesh that was the very heart of the Holy Flesh movement. And she says there's not a thread of truth in the entire fabric. The next term we want to look at is sinfulness. Sinfulness. Now, ness means a state of being. This is very different and far away from a tendency towards something. Sinfulness involves the actual practice of sinning. Ellen White applies this term to humans, but never to Jesus Christ. She would never wish anyone to think for a moment that she believed that Jesus sinned. For example, in Signs of the Times, July 30, 1902 again, paragraph 1. "Clad in the vestments of humanity, the Son of God came down to the level of those he wished to save. In him was no guile or sinfulness. He was ever pure and undefiled, yet he took upon him our sinful nature." You see some of those terms that we've been discussing? Sinful nature. He took upon himself our sinful nature, but he himself had no guile or sinfulness. Clothing his divinity with humanity, that he might associate with fallen humanity, he sought to regain for man that which by disobedience Adam had lost for himself and for the world. And then also in Signs of the Times of May 29, 1901, paragraph 11, "He was to take his position at the head of humanity by taking the nature, but not the sinfulness of man. In heaven was heard the voice, the Redeemer shall come to Zion, and unto them that turn from transgression Jacob, saith the Lord." Signs of the Times, May 29, 1901, paragraph 11. So it's very clear that Ellen White did not think of sinful and sinfulness as equivalent. How could Christ take a sinful nature if he had no sinfulness? You see, they're not equivalent. Now the next part I want to look at is sinlessness. Sinlessness. Again, ness is a state of being, and inspiration does not hesitate to use this expression in relationship to Jesus because Jesus never sinned and was never in the state of being a sinner. Ellen White saw Jesus' sinlessness in sinful flesh, and that this was what was going to be the experience of each one of his followers that would be imitated as we become one with Christ and as we experience the victory that he experienced. For example, in Selected Messages, Book 1, page 256 and paragraph 2. "We should have no misgivings Don't misunderstand this at all. We should have no misgivings in regard to the perfect sinlessness of the human nature of Christ. But he took our sinful nature. But we should have no misgivings concerning the perfect sinlessness of that nature. And then in Letters and Manuscripts, volume 16, manuscript from 110 of 1901, and paragraph 29. For nearly 6 weeks, the sinless one fought a battle with the powers of darkness in the wilderness of temptation, overcoming not on his account, but on our account, thus making it possible for every son and daughter to overcome through the merits of his sinlessness. And so he did this so that we could have this same experience. We who are in sinful flesh could still have this experience of sinlessness in our lives. And then also again from Signs of the Times of July 23, 1902. Everyone who by faith obeys God's commandments will reach the condition of sinlessness in which Adam lived before his transgression. Someone sent me a text last week and said, do you know of any Bible texts that speak about people living without sin when Jesus comes? And so I sent several texts, and this is a reference that basically says the same thing. You know, the Bible says in Ephesians 5 that Jesus is coming back for a church without spot, wrinkle, or any such thing, right? Well, is sin a wrinkle? Is sin a spot? Is sin a problem? Absolutely it is, isn't it? Sure it is. Now, there's no mention that these people that she's speaking of, though, in this last statement, will have lost their fallen sinful natures. Not at all. Their condition will be sinlessness in sinful nature. In Selected Messages, Book 1, page 256, in taking upon himself man's nature and its fallen condition, Christ did not in the least participate in its sin. So, sinful nature means simply a nature or a flesh that has tendencies, propensities, urgings towards sin. But that is not sin. Temptation is not sin. And we'll talk about, again, the concept of propensities, tendencies, next week. We will be looking at that in detail. But the implications, again, are very clear to us. Ellen White was careful in how she used these terms, as well as the Bible uses these terms, and carefulness. And there are places, yes, indeed, in the Bible where there seem to be contradictions. And there are places in the writings of Ellen White that seem to be contradictions. But I say the word appears because it is simply an appearance. It is a lack of our understanding, a lack of better study. But we're going to look at some of these things next week, particularly, that have been brought up. I'm trying to slow down. That have been brought up and are used as an objection to the truth and to support false doctrine. Now, there's a couple other statements I'd like to share before we close that I think are pertinent to what we're talking about that helps prepare the way for what we want to discuss later. And one of them is this statement from the Review and Herald of March 1, 1892. But many say that Jesus was not like us, that he was not as we are in the world, that he was divine, and that we cannot overcome as he overcame. Now she's saying this is what people are saying, that we can't overcome as he overcame. But then after that, after she stated that, she quoted at least 6 Bible verses. And I want to share those Bible verses with you. The first is Hebrews chapter 2. And these are verses that inspiration uses to substantiate that we can overcome just like Jesus overcame. Hebrews 2, 16 through 18. For verily he took not on him the nature of angels, but he took on him the seed of Abraham. Now, by the way, you see parallelism here in this verse. Do you see the parallelism between nature of angels and seed of Abraham? So when it says the seed of Abraham, it could have been the nature of Abraham. I mean, that's the concept of parallelism. Verse 17, wherefore in all things it behooved him to be made like unto his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered being tempted, he is able to succor them that are tempted. And also from Hebrews chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. For we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly into the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And then this statement in Revelation chapter 3 verse 21. To him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and sit down with my Father in his throne. And so, beloved, God has given all for us so that we might overcome sin and have the heavenly character. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 32, he that spared not his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things? Friends, the Logos was made sarx, was made flesh for us. For us. He who was holy and pure in the most infinite sense took upon his sinless nature our sinful nature, so that we might overcome as he overcame. But again, we mentioned this concept of propensities, passions, tendencies. We read about them in the spirit of prophecy. What we will find is that if we do a careful study of the writings of Ellen White, we will find a pattern that she follows that was followed by biblical writers. And that pattern is found in Selected Messages, Book 1, page 20, paragraph 2. And there it says, the Bible must be given in the language of men. Why? Because we're people. We're humans, right? I don't know the language of angels. I don't know the language of Mars, right? I have to have human language. That's the way God had to give the Bible. The Bible must be given in the language of men. Everything that is human is imperfect. Different meanings are expressed by the same word. There's not one word for each distinct idea. Now, the word sea. If I say the word sea, what do you think of? You think of an ocean or a body of water, or do you think of visually perceiving something? You know, right? But we have words that we have things, I should say, that have many words that express what they are. I have an automobile, I have a car, I have a vehicle. Different words that express the same idea, right? She says, different meanings are expressed by the same word. There is not one word for each distinct idea. The Bible was given for practical purposes. And so as we study the concepts of the passions and propensities, we're going to find that Ellen White used these concepts in different ways. And we're going to show you next week where she talked about passions and propensities which are to be controlled. But then she spoke of other passions and propensities that have to be eliminated. Some don't have to be eliminated. They just have to be controlled. That means you keep them. But some have to be eliminated. And this will be a key to helping us to understand these issues better. But friends, do not lose sight of the fact that Jesus understands your every burden and trial. And he wants to help you as you are right now to become like he is right now. And if you will surrender your life to him, to serve him fully in all ways, he will enable you to do that. I'd like to close our service with a word of prayer at this time. I know we have just a couple minutes left, but I'd like to close it at this time with a word of prayer and ask God's blessing, and then I'll come back to the folks in the back and we'll have our sharing time there in just a minute. So let us know where we can. Father in heaven, I want to thank you so much for your blessings to us, and I thank you for each one that's here this morning and with us on the broadcast. Please, Father, help us to understand that we have an elder brother at your throne who understands every trial and temptation we've ever had. And because of that, we can come boldly to your throne of grace because we have a high priest, a mediator, who understands and can relate and help us in every need. So please bless thy people this day, and I thank thee in Jesus' name. Amen.